March 7, 1945, 14:35 hours. At Remagen, the Rhine River burned with smoke and thunder as American forces did the impossible. They seized the Ludendorff Bridge intact. In the mud on the eastern bank lay hundreds of defeated German soldiers, bleeding, frightened, and certain they were about to die. They'd been told for years that capture meant torture, that Americans shot prisoners without hesitation. But what happened next defied everything Nazi propaganda had promised. Instead of bullets came bandages. Instead of kicks came canteens of water. American medics knelt beside the wounded men who had tried to kill them minutes earlier and stopped their bleeding. Soldiers offered food, cigarettes, and even chocolate from their rations. Across Germany, this same scene repeated thousands of times. By war's end, over 3.8 million German prisoners would fall into American hands, and against all expectations, they would be fed, treated, and kept alive. The story of how mercy replaced vengeance would not only change the outcome of the war, but also the future of two nations. Before the bridge at Remagen ever fell, another kind of weapon had already been at work: fear. From their first day in uniform, German soldiers were told that surrender meant a fate worse than death. Training manuals, films, and officers repeated the same warning: the Americans torture prisoners, the British shoot them, the Russians will skin you alive. It wasn't a rumor, it was policy psychological warfare aimed at Germany's own men. Joseph Goebbels filled the airwaves with stories of Allied brutality, claiming captured soldiers were mutilated or executed. Commanders reinforced it daily. Fight to the last bullet, save the final one for yourself. That terror made soldiers fight long after hope was gone. Even as cities burned and supply lines vanished, men clung to their rifles, believing capture was impossible. Many took their own lives rather than face what they thought awaited them. For years, they believed mercy was a lie. But when the war reached its breaking point, they would learn the truth on the other side of the Rhine. When German soldiers finally surrendered in 1945, they did so in terror. Many had been told that the moment they put their hands up, the Americans would execute them. Some cried, others prayed, waiting for the bullet they believed was coming. But the bullet never came. Instead, American voices shouted commands, sharp, firm, but not cruel. Prisoners were told to drop their weapons and form lines. Those who were bleeding were treated first. Medics worked through mud and smoke, binding wounds, offering morphine, and pouring clean water from canteens into the mouths of the wounded. For men conditioned to expect torture, these gestures were almost incomprehensible. The US Army had strict, clear procedures for dealing with prisoners of war. Each capture began the same way: disarm immediately, search for weapons or intelligence, but avoid unnecessary force. Provide water and first aid if required. Move prisoners to temporary collection points, feed them from American rations, then transport them safely to POW camps. It was systematic, consistent, and humane. Private James Henderson of the 9th Infantry Division later described it simply: Germans would surrender, looking terrified, some crying, some praying. They expected us to shoot them. We'd give them water, search them, and send them back to the collection point. The shock on their faces was always the same. They couldn't believe we weren't going to kill them. By March and April of 1945, such scenes unfolded across every front. Entire divisions of German soldiers surrendered daily. The numbers grew so fast that logistics struggled to keep up. Between June 1944 and May 1945, American forces captured an estimated 3.8 million German prisoners. Yet through that chaos, the US Army maintained remarkable discipline and consistency. Prisoners received daily rations between 2,000 and 3,000 calories, comparable to what American soldiers ate and far more than what German troops or civilians were surviving on. Wounded captives received medical care without regard to their nationality or affiliation. Over 180,000 German POWs underwent surgery or major medical treatment in American care. The results were undeniable. The mortality rate for German prisoners held by the United States in Europe was roughly 0.15%, an almost impossible figure in wartime. In comparison, mortality in Soviet camps often exceeded 30%. These statistics told a story more powerful than any speech or propaganda. American forces were not fighting a war of annihilation. They were fighting to end one, and they chose to do it with humanity. For captured German soldiers, the experience shattered years of indoctrination in a single afternoon. They had been told they would face death. Instead, they were shown mercy. The rules, the structure, the calm professionalism of the Americans, it wasn't just military order, it was moral order. Among the millions of surrenders that took place in 1945, one act carried more weight than any weapon: the offer of water. For many German prisoners, the first thing they experienced after capture wasn't shouting or humiliation, but the touch of a canteen pressed into their hands. Clean, cold water given freely by a soldier they'd been taught to hate. To men dehydrated, bleeding, and terrified, that moment was more than mercy, it was revelation. Everything they'd believed about the Americans collapsed the instant they tasted that water. Propaganda had painted the enemy as monsters, but monsters don't share water. Monsters don't kneel beside the wounded and pour life into their mouths. Across the front lines, countless testimonies repeated the same pattern: disbelief, hesitation, and then silent tears. Prisoners who expected to die began to understand they would live. Some whispered prayers. Others simply stared in shock, unable to process what was happening. American soldiers didn't see it as strategy or propaganda. It was instinct. You see someone suffering, you help them. A canteen passed, a wound dressed, a quiet word of reassurance, all done without ceremony. Yet to those receiving it, the meaning was profound. Psychologists later noted that these small acts of mercy became the most effective psychological weapon of the war. No leaflet or radio broadcast could have broken Nazi indoctrination the way that a single sip of water did, because water, unlike words, was universal. It needed no translation, no explanation. It spoke one truth: that even in war, humanity could survive. And for the prisoners who lived through that moment, the image never faded. Years later, many would still describe that first drink of water as the instant they realized everything they had been told was a lie. After water came food, and with it, another shock that no German soldier had been prepared for. They had expected starvation. Instead, they were fed, not with scraps or punishment rations, but with real meals: bread, canned meat, vegetables, coffee, sugar, even chocolate. The American military machine that could feed millions of its own soldiers extended the same efficiency to the men it captured. Prisoners were issued rations totaling between essential calories per day, enough to maintain health and strength. In many cases, it was more than they had received as soldiers of the collapsing Wehrmacht. To men who had gone hungry for months, the sight of full plates was almost surreal. Prisoners who had been fighting for a dying empire were suddenly handed the nourishment their own government could no longer provide. The Americans didn't feed them because they had to. They did it because it was right. One captured soldier near Cologne later remembered the shock of that moment. "We'd been starving for weeks, half alive on dry bread and watery soup. Then the Americans gave us canned meat, crackers, chocolate, and coffee. It was more food than I'd seen in months. I realized they could feed their prisoners better than Germany fed its own soldiers." That realization hit harder than any weapon. The abundance of food didn't just keep men alive, it forced them to see the truth. The enemy they had been told was barbaric was in reality organized, wealthy, and humane. Even small things like chocolate carried enormous weight. For soldiers who had not tasted sweets in years, a single bar became a symbol that the enemy saw them as people, not animals. You don't give chocolate to someone you plan to kill. By feeding their captives as equals under the law, the Americans turned survival itself into a message. Every meal served under guard, every warm drink poured into a prisoner's hands, became another quiet victory over hate. When the columns of captured soldiers finally reached the American prison camps, They braced for the worst. They expected barbed wire, starvation, and cruelty. Instead, they stepped into something far more controlled order. Each camp was a system of structure and routine. Prisoners were logged, deloused, assigned bunks, and given clean clothing. The barracks were basic but dry. Showers worked. Medical tents treated wounds with real supplies, not improvised bandages. For men who had come from collapsing front lines and burning cities, it felt unreal. The guards were not driven by vengeance. They enforced rules firmly but rarely with violence. Fights were broken up, not encouraged. Even when tempers flared, punishment meant extra labor or isolation, never the beatings the men had feared. Across Europe, more than 600 POW facilities operated under American control. Everyone followed the Geneva Conventions and in many cases exceeded them. Wounded prisoners were operated on, infections treated, and the sick quarantined until recovery. More German captives received surgical care during their imprisonment, care that many civilians in Germany could no longer obtain. One soldier later said, "I arrived expecting torment. Instead, I was given a bed and medical attention. The guards spoke to us as men, not as animals." I began to wonder who the real barbarians had been. The greatest shock wasn't comfort, it was fairness. The Americans seemed uninterested in revenge. They followed the procedure with mechanical precision, as if mercy itself were part of their orders. Inside those fences, thousands of former enemies began to see a new truth. The strength of a nation was not in how it destroyed its foes, but in how it treated them afterward. By the time many prisoners were transferred overseas or released, they had gained something their own army had taken from them: a sense of human worth. War dehumanizes. It teaches men to see enemies, not people. But in the quiet routines of captivity, something remarkable happened. Humanity began to reappear. For many German prisoners, it started with something simple: a cigarette. American GIs, most of them barely older than the men they'd been fighting, often shared tobacco with their captives. A soldier would light 2 cigarettes, hand one to a prisoner, and the two would sit in silence, smoke rising into the same gray sky. No words, no speeches, just 2 exhausted men taking the same breath of peace. One American recalled it clearly: "We had just captured a German position. The fight was over. I was smoking when one of their wounded men kept glancing at my cigarette. I offered him one. He took it, and we sat there without talking. The war was still going on around us, but for that moment, we weren't enemies. Just men." Acts like that are repeated thousands of times. A cigarette, a crust of bread, a word of reassurance. None of it was planned, none of it ordered. It came naturally to soldiers who had seen too much death to waste more on hate. For the prisoners, these gestures broke something deep inside them, not their pride, but their illusion. They had been told Americans were savages, yet those same Americans were sharing food, water, and smoke with them. One prisoner later wrote, "When an American soldier offered me a light, I felt something inside me change. He had no reason to be kind, but he was. In that moment, I saw that mercy was stronger than propaganda. In those simple, unspoken exchanges, war's greatest lie collapsed. Enemies became men again. And for many who lived through it, that shared humanity, a spark of kindness on a battlefield of hatred, would become the memory that defined the end of the war more than any victory parade ever could." For years, German soldiers had been told that mercy was weakness, that surrender meant dishonor, and that their enemies were monsters. But now, behind the barbed wire of American camps, that illusion began to fall apart. At first, the disbelief was total. Prisoners waited for the cruelty they'd been promised. Days passed. No beatings, no executions. Then came confusion. The guards treated them fairly, the medics healed their wounds, and the cooks fed them every day. If this wasn't punishment, then what was it? The realization came slowly, painfully. Everything they had been told was a lie. They had fought for a government that thrived on hatred and fear. and now their supposed enemies were showing them decency. The propaganda that had driven them to fight to the last bullet disintegrated under the weight of reality. One German non-commissioned officer later said, "For days I waited for torture, for humiliation. It never came. Instead, they gave me food and medicine. That's when I knew everything I believed about the Americans was false. And if that was false, what else had they lied about?" That question echoed through every camp. If the Americans weren't monsters, then what about everything else? The stories about Allied atrocities, about racial purity, about the Holocaust itself. The cracks in their beliefs widened until the entire foundation collapsed. This quiet collapse of faith in Nazi ideology did more to break the power of the regime than any bomb or bullet. It wasn't forced re-education. It wasn't propaganda. It was the truth, proven by actions that no lie could erase. Thousands of captured soldiers emerged from their cages not just alive, but transformed men who now understood that strength didn't come from cruelty, and that moral power could outlast military might. In the months that followed their capture, German prisoners were finally allowed to write letters home. For many, it was the first time their families knew they were still alive. Mothers who had already grieved their sons suddenly received envelopes stamped "Prisoner of War, U.S. Army." Inside were words they could hardly believe. The letters spoke of clean beds, regular meals, and medical care. They described guards who treated them fairly, even kindly. "I am alive," one wrote. "The Americans have treated my wounds and fed me every day." The stories we were told about their cruelty were lies. At first, families thought it was censorship, some kind of trick. But as more letters arrived, the pattern was impossible to deny. Across bombed-out neighborhoods and broken cities, families began to share these messages. A mother would show her neighbor. A wife would read her husband's words aloud in the shelter. The news spread from one street to another. The Americans were not what we were told they were. For a nation built on propaganda, these letters were devastating. They carried more credibility than any broadcast or leaflet because they came from loved ones, from men who had been there, who had seen the truth with their own eyes. What began as private relief became a quiet revolution. The Nazi regime had built its power on fear and falsehood, but the handwritten testimonies of its captured soldiers began to undo that power from within. In homes across Germany, the question whispered in camp after camp began to take hold among civilians too. If they lied about this, what else did they lie about? The truth was traveling faster than the regime could silence. It carried not by weapons, but by the simple words of sons who had seen mercy and lived to tell it. When the war finally ended, the long columns of German prisoners began their journey home. Most returned in 1946, thinner, older, but alive. They came back to cities in ruins, families scattered, and a homeland unrecognizable from the one they'd left behind. Yet many carried something their fellow countrymen had lost: perspective. They had seen another world, one that operated on fairness and restraint. They had watched the American war machine efficient, unstoppable act without hatred. And they had lived under a system that treated them not as criminals, but as men bound by the rules of war. To the families who welcomed them home, their stories sounded almost unbelievable. Some arrived wearing clean American-issued uniforms, well-fed, even carrying savings from labor in the camps. Others brought memories of doctors who saved their lives, guards who shared cigarettes, and chaplains who prayed for both sides. One former prisoner recalled, "My mother cried when she saw me. She said she'd been told the Americans killed all their captives. I told her the truth, they healed me instead." These personal stories spread through post-war Germany like ripples through water. They shaped how a broken nation viewed its former enemy, and helped lay the emotional groundwork for something that would have seemed impossible just a year before: trust. The men who had once believed surrender was shameful became witnesses to a greater victory, the triumph of humanity over vengeance. They became fathers and teachers, men who told their children, "Our enemies treated us better than our leaders did." Those words echoed through a generation rebuilding its identity. And in that rebuilding, a bridge, stronger than the one at Remagen, was formed, a moral bridge between two former enemies who had discovered that peace could be built not through fear, but through mercy. The war in Europe was won with firepower, tanks, bombers, and the sheer weight of numbers. But the peace that followed was built on something far quieter: mercy. For the millions of German prisoners who expected death and received life instead, the war ended not with gunfire, but with compassion. A sip of water, a meal shared, a wound treated. These were not grand gestures, yet they carried the power to break an empire of lies. Propaganda could tell men that mercy was weakness. It could make them fear, surrender, hate their enemies, and fight to the last breath. But it could not survive the truth of an American soldier kneeling beside a wounded enemy, pouring water into his hands. The statistics tell one story: 3.8 million prisoners, 0.15% mortality, hundreds of thousands healed and fed. But behind those numbers are millions of moments that defined what kind of people the victors chose to be. Mercy is not the absence of strength. It is strength restrained by conscience. In 1945, amid the ruins of Europe, the United States proved that victory did not have to mean vengeance. By treating its enemies with dignity, it laid the foundation for the peace that followed, a peace built not on fear, but on respect. For the men who survived, the memory never faded. Years later, many would say that a single act of kindness, a drink of water, a cigarette shared, changed everything they believed about the world. And perhaps that was the real victory of the war. Not the fall of a bridge or the signing of a treaty, but the rediscovery of humanity itself in the hands of one soldier who chose to offer water instead of bullets.